AdLib is the DSP-agnostic buying platform to scale your programmatic campaigns smarter, faster, and more profitably. AdLib helps independent agencies and marketers deliver premium programmatic performance without the complexity, cost, or overhead of traditional DSPs. Their platform provides the tools, data, and automation to run enterprise-quality campaigns, from CTV and audio to geofencing and YouTube, all under one roof with zero trafficking headaches. Plus, they're not just a platform, they're your growth partner. The AdLib team helps you win new business, expand budgets, and deliver measurable ROI that keeps clients coming back. It's time to unlock programmatic. Join leading marketers worldwide who are using AdLib to deliver more campaigns with better results. Check out getadlib.com.
Welcome to Open Market, a podcast about building companies in the advertising industry. I'm Joe Zappa. I'm joined by Eric Franchi, who is going to give us a sneak peek at the hot companies coming down the pike.
The hot companies down the pike. I don't know if we should speak to companies specifically or some of the trends that we're seeing, because this is a very unique moment in ad tech and early stage investing, which is where I spend the majority of my time. So deal flow is at an all-time high here at Aperion Ventures. Corey Farragut and I, Corey's friend of the pod, we've had him on a few times. And one of the things that we've noticed is there's like a few trends happening and a few like categories emerging. I would say existing category that has probably the most heat that we've seen in some time is, believe it or not, companies trying to build self-serve ad offerings for SMBs and performance-based marketers in CTV. So everybody's trying to be the next streamer, or everybody's trying to be the next Vibe, or everybody's trying to be the next TV Scientific. I don't know. I would say that over the course of the past few months, we have looked at maybe close to 10 companies doing just that. So bit of a bubble forming, bit of a, confirmation bias from, a couple of transactions happening last year in that category. It's getting quite crowded. And I feel bad for all of the dry cleaners and plumbers that are being subjected to all of the growth marketing tactics that I think inevitably these companies are doing for their customer acquisition.
Well, that makes a ton of sense. For the past few years, I've been saying the three hot buzzwords in ad tech are CTV, performance, and AI. And that trend of performance TV essentially encapsulates all three. I think also where that trend is coming from, where you see founders glomming onto this, is that the open internet has its challenges, right? And I mean the open internet like very broadly conceived. I mean like everything in the media ecosystem other than the walled gardens. CTV is a bright spot there, and then it's especially a bright spot if you can, as the performance TV narrative suggests, take some of those search and social advertisers, those walled garden advertisers, and bring them into the open internet ecosystem. So it makes sense to me from a venture standpoint, if you're trying to build the next billion-dollar ad tech company, that's where the growth would be.
I agree. The challenge, the question, the thing that we wrestle with is customer acquisition for an enterprise CTV business is very straightforward. You're going to go to holdcos, you're going to go to top 500, top 100 brands. If you're building for performance CTV, customer base is kind of known, but it's different. But SMBs is a completely different beast. I don't know what the stat is. I've heard everything from like 15 to 30 million SMBs in the US. So that customer acquisition plan will be what unlocks the eventual winner in this space. But I also wonder if the eventual winner in this space may actually be Meta, if they come out with their rumored CTV offering, or obviously Google, Amazon. It's a real question. Customer acquisition is like everything for this category.
Yeah. Or does one of these companies, or I don't know if this would be a lane for Vibe. I know that Arthur has said publicly, Arthur Curry, the CEO of Vibe, has said that his goal is to be listed on the NASDAQ. Does Meta buy that company or one of these new companies?
Yep. That's the question. The Pinterest move with TV Scientific, which nobody predicted, then everybody realized that it was obvious. Anyway, so that's a category I think that there's, no surprise. There's two categories that we've been keeping our eye on, and then, a couple of areas that are just like, known and but sort of adjacent to ad tech that we've been investing in. I'll cover both quickly. So the first is new categories. I would say there's two that deal flow is super hot right now. So the first is, I don't know what you would call this, but there are a bunch of like mobile apps that are like chat and entertainment based. So Character.ai and others that are probably quite unfamiliar to us in the kind of like, the premium ad tech ecosystem that have, massive global engagement. And they're basically like chatbots where people will chat with fantasy characters, chat with superheroes, chat with AI girlfriends and boyfriends. It's a giant category. And there's an ecosystem of companies that are emerging to help monetize this space with the bet that chatbots become like completely proliferated. They are the new publishers. They're the new kind of media format. Similarly to the SMBC TV thing, we've looked at probably half a dozen of them over the course of the past like weeks and months. And they're all doing the same thing. They're all these ad networks that are trying to basically insert native ads inside of chat experiences. So you're having a conversation about, I don't know, a movie, a superhero, boom, an ad for a relevant movie or a relevant game comes up in feed in a native-like manner. This is an interesting category. This is a category that there are companies similar to, back in the day when there were the first DSPs and SSPs, they all look alike. They're all going after the same inventory. History is repeating itself. I'm just wondering again if this is a durable category that's going to, create winners, or if it ultimately becomes, something that is part of the broader ad tech ecosystem. But, there's like more than a handful of companies that are all going after this. Names like Koa, Zero Click, Context, Simula. They're all kind of going after the same inventory, the same publishers.
I have a couple questions for you about this that I'm sure you're also asking to these founders. The first is, will there be a lot of supply to be had in this category, or will the supply from the chatbot inventory be concentrated in a few new walled gardens, i.e. like, Claude and ChatGPT? Like, are there going to be a bunch of like essentially independent chatbot apps that can be monetized? And then the second is, what are all these ad tech companies, other than like basic like advertising infrastructure, what are they adding to those environments?
So on one, there are, wildly extreme views on this. View one is probably the bear case, in that there's going to be like fun apps that will hit their limit and all of the functionality probably could occur within the big LLMs. The open ads guys, this was there for you because they thought this was an interesting business and they pivoted it out of this business, right? So it's like, these apps reach a ceiling and they are not a scaled, durable category. The bull case is that this is the beginning of the trend, somewhat like in the beginning of mobile apps, like the biggest apps were flashlights and, kind of cute little toys that ultimately got scale and then led to the birth of an ecosystem. That's the bull case. Nobody's sure. So it's an interesting space to watch. What are they doing specifically? I think, building anything native from the ground up, particularly in the age of AI, gives you some advantages with not having the legacy tech, with being able to kind of build agentic, be able to build for these types of experiences. So, while you might invest in advertising infrastructure generally, in this age of AI first stuff is the reason why this stuff might actually be unique, and they could be building next gen ad servers, next gen ad formats that might have applicability outside of what is, a very limited category right now. So interesting little space, something to keep an eye on.
No, I think there will be tons of companies in that category. What I don't know if you just said AI native, but yeah, I had a little back and forth with that tech god about that on X, because he was like, what is the point of the phrase AI native? Like, is it just like marketing BS? And I was like, well, if a 20-year-old company is using it, then yes. But to me, there is a meaningful distinction between a company that popped up in the last couple of years that genuinely was built like with and for AI versus a company that was built 20 years ago that is now trying to adopt AI driven technology. And I'm not saying that like calling yourself AI native is like a silver bullet, but I do think there's a meaningful distinction there. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. And I chirped in and then I didn't feel like debating ad tech god. So I quietly kind of like left the room. My definition is very simple. Could this business be built without AI? Which I think discounts a lot of the announcements from legacy companies that are now calling themselves or products AI native. Anyway, another category that we're focused on is absolutely an AI native category. And, Corey, again, is spending a lot of time in this space, and he's got a little acronym that he's, created for them, called integrated marketing platforms. We'll see if it takes shape, but basically where there is API access for media. So Snap, TikTok, Meta, Google, TTD. If you have API access, there's a type of company that is being born that is a layer on top of those that will ultimately look to allow buyers to, buy in an intelligent kind of AI decisioned way across all of these platforms, be able to have like hyper specific messaging and ad formats, and most importantly, optimize spend across these platforms. Whether these become what ultimately the DSP was destined to be, kind of a layer that sits on top of them, whether this becomes like really intelligent measurement and optimization, I don't know. But again, it's an area we're seeing some heat. We're spending a bunch of time in.
Integrated marketing platform is interesting. I feel like I've seen other companies call this something like a workflow automation platform.
Yeah.
But similar vibe.
Yeah. No, exactly that.
Yeah, which makes sense, especially with where user interfaces are heading, right? Like the SaaS to agent shift illustrates that users of all kinds of technologies are going to expect that they can just talk to something and it's going to do the work across a bunch of different surfaces, right? And so it makes sense to me that the like advertiser of the future is not going to want to navigate through a bunch of different DSP interfaces. This is also why we've talked about like the complexity of certain ad platforms used to be a moat and now is becoming a anvil around the necks of those organizations, because it used to be, okay, you would spend a ton of time learning to use a specific DSP and now you're locked in. Now it's like the traders of tomorrow are going to be like, I'm not spending, weeks of my life learning how to use an interface. I'm just going to expect it to work. And so it does make sense to me that technology will move in this direction. The question is, does one of those DSPs sort of master this, or is there some sort of integrated marketing platform, workflow automation platform that sits on top of all of them and helps users navigate?
Yep, that is the question. And that's going to be the bet for a lot of these companies. I don't know. Final bit, and we can get into some of the stuff you wanted to talk about, is an area that we're digging into that is not like at all emergent. It's quite mature, but we think is a very interesting one. And believe it or not, it's mobile apps. So we did our first pure play investment in the mobile app space. Actually, earlier this week, we closed it. It hasn't been announced yet. We're working on another one. As I've spent time in mobile apps, I've been just like blown away, because it's a space that has like been adjacent to ad tech as we think about it. But I think it's very quickly converging. And obviously AppLovin is, the most valuable, company in our space. So things that I've learned, mobile apps, a lot of this is gaming. So if we think about some of the pain that the quote unquote open web has experienced with respect to the shifts, with AI, people going to websites less, traffic going down, spending time, within the search interfaces, that's not happening in gaming environments. People are actually playing games a lot more, right? So I think it's at once AI resistant. Number two, the market is enormous. So a couple of stats for you. 95,000 mobile games were downloaded per minute in 2025. Per minute. Number two, 81.7 billion in global mobile game spend in 2025. And then number three, there's 3 billion mobile gamers. So this is like the size of the internet. It's quite fascinating. And then final point that I've gotten to understand is that the publishers are the advertisers. Because the publishers,
they're
again,
using it for user acquisition. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And then, final point, because it's mobile, the ability to, truly kind of measure outcomes is better than anything else. So if you can develop a platform that drives performance, like the floodgates open. So super interesting space. One that I think is, as I said before, kind of like both, large, resistant to AI, but also has its own legacy challenges that I think the agentic platforms are going to have a really interesting opportunity to do some cool stuff in. So watch this space. We're going to be spending a lot more time in it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you basically just made the bull case for AppLovin, right?
Which
is like, as you said, why, they've become the biggest company in our space.
Black box. I mean, as black box
here
as you
are the critiques, right? Unveil the critiques, right? It's that black box. People really question the quality of the inventory, because we've all used mobile apps or mobile games where, you have to like click the ad to get through, and you're not really paying attention to it, but you're just like, I gotta click this to keep playing my game. And so there are questions about quality and the true impact. However, I've seen third-party consultants or experts like, Olivia Corrin from House saying, no, we've run the tests on AppLovin and actually it is very effective and drives incremental impact. So ultimately, the numbers don't lie, but that's where you really need third-party verification to prove that the outcomes truly are incremental. And that is a great segue into the second topic we wanted to discuss, Eric, which is the evolving primary messaging challenge of what we've been calling the outcomes era for the past couple of years. So a couple of years ago, I wrote this blog post on calling this period of advertising that we're in the outcomes era. And over the past couple of years, I think that thesis has really been borne out. Like tons of companies in the space have adopted the term outcomes as central to their messaging. Obviously, a couple of my clients have, but many others have as well. I even saw like Nielsen, for example, like a few weeks ago now announced they have an outcomes product, right? Because indirectly, they probably want to get in on the performance shift in TV advertising. Now, the problem is when every ad platform and their mom is talking about driving outcomes, right? And in many cases, it's like a phrase like driving full funnel outcomes across the open internet. You then need to differentiate, right? Because if you are just saying the blandest, broadest version of we drive outcomes, then that message might work if you are one of the one or two like largest companies associated with that message. If you're not huge and it's not credible that you actually drive those outcomes, you are just going to be forgotten. No one's going to believe you, or it's just not going to matter because they're like, okay, I could go to the 7th largest DSP driving outcomes, or I could just go to the largest one or two with whom I probably already have a relationship. So I view this differentiating within the outcomes era as sort of the number one messaging challenge ad tech companies are facing now. And I'm having some very interesting conversations with some incumbent companies and some startups about how to do that. For example, if you are in TV, right, and you want to get in on the performance TV thing and you want to say you drive outcomes, it's not just about saying you drive outcomes. It's about figuring out what is the unique data, perhaps, that you have at your disposal that is going to allow you to drive those outcomes. Or it might be supply, right? It might be your transmit client in a peer and portfolio company, and you have live sports inventory that very few other people have, and you have native ad formats that no one else has. It might be commerce data, right? It might be Infileon buying Catalina or Criteo with the commerce graph they developed over the past few years. But it is all about building a story around the unique edge that allows you to drive outcomes or measure them better than others.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I question any company that doesn't have this as part of their like messaging and cornerstone, which is pretty incredible, right? Like, if this seemed to happen, first slowly and then all at once. One thing that's so fascinating is, so we're recording this on Wednesday, May 13th, 2026. The upfronts are happening in New York or just happened. And I didn't attend any, but I, read some of the recaps. Even the largest broadcasters and certainly the streamers have outcomes all over their messaging. So Amazon had a bunch of announcements, again, around outcomes, but so did NBC Universal, which to me was made a lot of sense, right? They have Universal Ads. It's a, performance CTV engine. They've got a lot of awesome ad tech. But this used to be the domain of celebrities and our latest shows and, very much kind of like brand investing. And it's become all about outcomes is, kind of thought one. Thought two is I believe that this will be a big theme around M&A over the course of the next 12 months or so as companies that are not outcomes native or don't have this as a cornerstone of their offering. I think they're going to be under tremendous pressure from their customers and from the industry to have this as kind of part of their arsenal. And I'll point to the recent acquisition of TVision by Viant. And the messaging, around that is how attention, can be tied to outcomes was super clear. So I think this is, not going to slow down, and it's only going to spark, I think, more confusion and demands in the marketplace around this. And then also some cycles around M&A.
When we were having those debates in the industry around outcomes and quality, like my point was always, these two things aren't actually in tension. What's inevitably going to happen is the quality people are going to be swallowed up by the outcomes people. Like they're like, it's going to be like, if you're an attention startup, right? And you're like, we're all about quality or whatever. Yeah. Okay. But it's how do we use quality media to, in the end, drive a better outcome? And that's exactly what you're talking about with like Vine acquiring TVision is you have this company, this DSP that's been touting, you know, autonomous advertising in the outcomes era, acquiring a startup in TVision that helps you ensure that your impressions are actually quality impressions, right? You're actually reaching real people and that then is going to relate to and drive a better outcome. So I think, you know, you'll see the same thing from players like TTD, which needs to go out there and not only probably acquire technology that will make the ads more effective and sort of show that full funnel performance, not just brand advertising, but also go acquire like data assets that give them a unique edge in that area as well.
Yeah, they're all signals that are going to be used to drive towards, you know, the ultimate thing, which is an outcome. So yeah, I never got why these things were thought of, you know, being opposed or mutually exclusive. It's a little bit of legacy thinking, you know, brand versus performance. At the end of the day, like it's all performance. So we're aligned on that one. People are yapping about Jeff Green talking about the first dollar is going to be spent on the open web. Do you know where that's coming from? And do you have a view on that? I'm just catching up on things. Everybody's yelling about it.
I'm catching up on it as well. But the main thing I would say about that is Shiv Gupta from U of Digital had a great tweet where he said, TGD is still putting at the center of their messaging objectivity and the open internet. And look, TTD made a name for itself and became, before Apple ever, the largest independent ad tech company, talking about being the champion of the open internet. And I think what we're seeing is they still sort of occupy that position, but the open internet is facing major headwinds from AI and is not looked upon fondly by public market investors. At least that would seem to be the case. And so you need to make a new argument about being the champion of the open internet ends up being an expansionary opportunity. And that's where I think the conversation we were just having dovetails with the TTD conversation is you have to go out and acquire either technologies or data assets that make investors and others in the space bullish on your company as a growth play. And to me, that means, of course, they've been heading in the direction of TV, but that means, you know, some combination of TV, commerce, like attention data. These are the kinds of acquisitions that, yeah, TDD will probably need to make, because just saying, you know, we're objective in the walled gardens or not, that message has run its course.
Agreed. Okay. And speaking of messaging, you had some thoughts on messaging. What's going on?
Well, last week I did a solo pod where I spoke about the difficulty that ad tech companies have with messaging, and I contextualized it in the outcomes era conversation we were just having. And I'm just seeing this across a lot of different companies that, again, the impulse is to just be like open internet, omni-channel, outcomes, yada, yada. And where the challenge really comes in is narrowing that message. And I thought maybe you would have a complementary perspective in that, like, you've advised a lot of startups, right? You ran Undertone for a decade plus. You have that experience of like, why is it so hard to narrow down to like the one thing? And then if you were advising a CEO who was like, well, we do these like 5 things. We're an SSP, we have strengths in CTV, but also native, but also curation. How do you think they whittle it down?
There's so many companies that sound the same, which is really difficult when you, the CEO, are like not in front of a customer to be able to, you know, have that conversation. So I think that messaging is a perennial problem for ad tech companies. I think part of the, and we do this is because, again, kind of legacy thinking around wanting to be able to say yes to everything and just chase dollars. But I think in 2026, that absolutely works against you. So my advice is to pick a lane, right? Like actually focus on what the business is and, you know, differentiate and carve out a space for yourself that you become the person and you become the company that does this, right? And we've got examples that we talk about perennially on this pod. TV Scientific is credited with building establishing and becoming the leader in performance CTV. Aperium is the only firm that invests exclusively in ad tech and martech. So I think you really need to define a space and define yourself within that space, because if not, I think it gets super, super hard for people to understand what you do, what bucket to put you in, and ultimately be successful.
If people were naming like the 2 to 3 terms that were associated with Undertone in its heyday, would it be like mobile creative ad network or something like that? What do you,
yeah. Creative, unique formats, unique technology, stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. I think also the challenge is for people to remember that you will only ultimately be known for one or two things. So if you don't choose, the market will choose for you.
Yeah. What I just took 5 minutes to say, you said it in a sentence, right? Like literally you have one shot to be remembered for something, and you need to be pounding the table on that thing. And then also be consistently pounding the table on that thing. Because that's the only way you're going to have the frequency and recency to have people actually understand and think about you for that thing.
Right. Which leads us to our final topic, which is sort of tactical, is LinkedIn content buckets. Because if you have that differentiated narrative, as Eric was just saying, you then need to take it to the market. Many ways you can do that, events, traditional PR, and content. And obviously, we are in particular proponents of what we at Sharp call executive evangelism, which is the CEO taking that message directly to their audience on social primarily, though also newsletters and podcasts. And so what I wanted to talk about here is I have constant conversations with prospects and clients about how you navigate posting on LinkedIn or generally putting the CEO out there when the CEO is not naturally a ham, right? There are some people who are extremely prolific. They love to do the LinkedIn thing. They're not going to have an issue. But most CEOs and executives are actually not like that, right? They're afraid of the criticism, or they feel like it's showboating for them to be out there. So then the question becomes, how do you do this right? So I'm going to submit to you, Eric, the 4 LinkedIn content buckets. You tell me if you have any reflections on that or which appeal to you or whatever. To me, there are 4 different things to post about on LinkedIn. The first is thought leadership. This is the classic. This is like stuff's going on in the industry. I'm going to comment on it, right? So there's a big news story each week. You put out a take. And that, of course, then allows you to establish yourself as an expert and also get in your personal sales pitch and how whatever's going on in the industry relates to what you're doing. Ari would be the paradigmatic example of that. The clients I love to mention, the Vanderhoops, Jason, they also do a good job of that. The second would be building in public, which means your story as an entrepreneur and as a company or as a CEO. This could be leadership lessons, company culture things, your experience fundraising or hiring. It can also broadly conceived be personal stuff, right? Like I was talking to my client ShopSense, and one of the executives there had a take on youth sports, right? To me, I was like, that's awesome. Do it. We wouldn't want it to be the only thing we talk about, but that's super relatable, right? Tons of people in the industry, they have kids and they're spending tons of money and time on this subject. And if you have a take on that, get it out there and it'll drive some engagement, maybe introduce you to some new people who don't care about the core thing you're talking about, right? So it casts a wider net and maybe brings in a wider audience. And then, you might not get a huge lead off that post, but maybe that then brings in someone new to the audience who will be a lead on the next post. Third is case studies, right? You don't want to constantly sell, but you can talk about what's working in an instructive way. And then the fourth is data and trends. And I've had a couple clients, Pure 39, DeepSea, who have done a particularly good job of this, where we take data from their platform and we create reports around it. And then that becomes a bunch of different content that can educate the industry on the state of, CTV or publisher quality or whatever it is. So there are 4 different kinds of content that any company could potentially do. And it doesn't all just need to be an Ari style sort of CEO who has a really deep understanding of the mechanics of the industry commenting on trends.
Who comes to mind with bucket number 2? Building in public and personal stuff. I have one that when you listed this out came to mind immediately, maybe more recently, but does anyone come to mind for you?
I will name 2 people. Bach comes to mind, right? He's out there doing
building
that kind
in public
of content.
for sure.
Yeah, he's definitely part, especially with the dawn of agentic advertising. He's been writing about that coming together. Who's partnering with all this stuff. He'll talk about the CompStab Nexus. I think Olivia Corey from House, I mentioned her earlier, I think, about incrementality, because that's kind of her key term. And she's definitely a thought leader and will share data. But I think she also on Twitter will talk about what's going on with her company. And I like following her journey. And I feel like I'm invested, even though we've never actually spoken one-on-one. So that's another example.
So interesting. The one that came to mind for me on making, I think, her posts personal, but also always kind of in context of the business, is Allie Manning from Chalice. Like, I think that over the course of the past year, she's done a really good job about this. Like just this morning, she had a post, kind of pinch me founder moment. Chalice was all on a bus. Like, it was like, oh my God, we could, fit our entire company on a bus. We're that large now. And I think she's done a really good job of like showing the journey of a founder in a really, I think, thoughtful way. And, she posts a lot of pictures and everything like that. I think she's done a really good job on that front. Juxtaposed against, maybe I think a company that's doing well and a CEO that is doing well, and I'd love to see more, is actually Double Verify. Double Verify, comes out with a lot of case studies, and obviously with the nature of their business, a lot of data and trends. And Mark is, I think, increasingly, Mark Zagorski, who I'm a huge fan of, increasingly like more visible. I'd love to see more of kind of like Mark's personality come through. But, to me, the one that came to mind around like case studies and data was actually, interestingly, DV.
Yeah, I agree. They do a great job with that. And it makes sense given the nature of their business, right? They should have great data on what's going on in the ecosystem. But I agree, it could be complemented by some of that more personal stuff, more opinion-driven stuff. But maybe that is a great example, actually, of if you're not comfortable or you just don't want to do the personal stuff or the opinion-driven stuff, put out your data, right? Like get your engineering team to work on it or your product team and see what interesting trends you can reveal to the ecosystem. And that's an example of how to do it well if you're not a super personality-driven CEO or founder.
Yeah, what do you think about Adam Feroji all of a sudden coming out of the woodwork and on like all of these big tech podcasts?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think that they rose to prominence and went on an incredible run without being very public. And companies can learn the wrong lesson from that. They can say, well, we've never done communications really in a big way, so why start now? But I think what you saw is when people don't know you and you're not defining the conversation, and then you have a massive attention driving success, the critics come out of the woodwork. And then there were all these, short sellers writing about AppLovin, and eventually Adam did that blog post and such, but he wasn't necessarily a public face, defining their position in the market. And so they seem to have landed on a systematic correction to that. And I think that makes a lot of sense. My take on this is always, the CEO is the chief evangelist, and if you don't define the market, your competitors will or your critics will, right? So let's have you be the voice. You can't shut down the critics necessarily, but you can drown them out, especially if you do have a platform as big as Adam deserves, given the success of the company.
He is a generational founder, and some of the interviews that he's doing, I'm so happy to see it because he's got so much to offer. And the story of AppLovin is so wild that it deserves to be out there. And I think he deserves to be seen in the light of a lot of CEOs who have kind of transcended the company brand. So I love to see it.
Totally agree. I think that's a good note to end on.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Joe, and we will see you next week, everybody.
Thank you, Eric.